America has been in NATO for over 76 years, and for those who don't know, NATO is a military faction, or also called the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization. To understand why America should leave NATO, we need to go back to its foundation and why it was created in the first place. After World War II ended in 1945, the world fell into two spheres of influence, that of the capitalistic West and the other being the communist East. This is what we call the Iron Curtain. At this time, America needed a way to stop the Soviet Union from expanding and getting more puppets. So on April 4th, 1949, NATO was officially created. Some of the people who supported this alliance was President Harry Truman. Truman strongly supported a permanent alliance to contain Soviet power and ensure Western Europe's recovery. His administration saw NATO as part of a broader strategy that also included the Marshall Plan, which was a plan to rebuild Europe after the war, and the Truman Doctrine, which was a foreign policy established in 1947 that committed the United States to providing military and economic aid to countries run by communism. Another important figure in the creation of NATO is the U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. He was the main man who led the negotiations with the European governments to create a mutual defense pact, signed the North Atlantic Treaty on behalf of the U.S. on April 1949. The way NATO works is under Article 5, which is the collective defense. It says that if one NATO country is attacked, all members consider it an attack on everyone. Each country then decides how to respond, usually by sending military support, aid, or intelligence. NATO doesn't vote by majority. Instead, every decision is made unanimously. All 32 member countries must agree before NATO can take action. This ensures unity, but also can be slow down decisions. Each country contributes to NATO's defense forces and budget voluntarily. NATO doesn't have its own standing army. Members provide troops and equipment for missions. However, there is a target that each member must meet. They should spend 2% of its GDP on defense. But for many years, NATO members failed to meet this defense spending target of 2% of GDP. Furthermore, NATO has become obsolete for America. One of the reasons behind it is that it drags America into conflicts that it has no business in, and ends up draining more and more of America's money. An example of this would be the war in Ukraine. If NATO was dissolved in 1991 when the USSR fell, then NATO expansion would not spread on the Russian border, and America would not be involved in this conflict. Even though Ukraine is not a NATO member, they have been trying to get membership since 2002. With their aspirations becoming a more formal objective in the following years, including the 2008 Bucharest summit where NATO agreed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Although progress stalled from 2010 to 2014, but now this has become a proxy war for America, meaning that we do not have our own troops on the ground, but we are giving massive amounts of equipment and money. As of August 21st, 2025, the U.S. has allocated approximately $134 billion in aid to Ukraine since January 2022. Instead of sending that money abroad, we could have used it in our own country where we have more problems. Another problem with NATO is how much America puts into NATO compared to other NATO members. For both national defense and spending and direct contribution to NATO's budget, the United States is the largest contributor by a significant margin compared to other member countries. For example, the United States provides $967 billion in aid, whereas other countries like Germany give $97 billion, and France giving $64 billion. This shows that America is putting in more than they're getting out. The reason I say this is that because these countries need America, not the other way around. America has the hegemony of the Western Hemisphere, and that's where we should put our focus to countries that are closer to us. Because the good thing about America is that there's an entire ocean separating us from the Eastern Hemisphere where all these problems happen. The money we spend in NATO is more money we could spend on our own home, because the other NATO countries are not putting in the same contribution as America. The other thing about NATO is that it's extremely slow and filled with bureaucracy. Because decisions require full agreement, NATO can struggle to act quickly in emergencies or controversial situations. And NATO has a way of making small conflicts into larger ones where multiple countries are involved. When that happens, it is harder to make peace because everyone has to agree on something, which is harder the more countries you have that are involved. Many people say the Cold War ended in 1991. If that is true, why is NATO still around? But then the question becomes, what would happen if America left NATO? If America left, well, for one, the U.S. provides nearly 70% of NATO's total military force. That includes troops, weapons, and funding. Without America, NATO would lose most of its nuclear deterrent, its global air and naval power, much of its logistic and intelligence support. Nations like Germany, France, and the UK would need to spend far more on defense, way above the 2% GDP target, possibly even form a new European defense alliance, rely more on European Union's military cooperation instead of NATO. The U.S. also maintains tens of thousands of troops in Europe, along with bases logistic networks that cost billions. Critics say that this money and manpower could be redirected to domestic priorities, like infrastructure, border security, technology, innovation, and reducing national debt. Leaving NATO would free up resources for domestic strengthening instead of overseas commitments. Some people might say that those European countries cannot defend themselves, but the combined GDP of the European NATO countries is greater than Russia's many times over. Europe has the economic and industrial base to build its own defense system. For example, through the European Union's defense initiatives, critics argue that by staying in NATO, the U.S. discourages Europe from becoming self-reliant and creating long-term dependency. NATO no longer matches today's global threats. The U.S. is overpaying for European security, and America would be stronger and more safe and more dependent by stepping back and letting allies handle their own defense. Anyways, thanks for listening and watching, and let me know what you think in the comments. Should America leave or stay in NATO?